Part 1. The Moral Case for Coal. The Ethics of Complicity with and Amongst Australian Pro-Coal Lobbyists by Kari Dahlgren. Abstract. Concern with climate change and coal's contribution to it has centered coal in an intensely moralized politics of accusation in Australia. This paper discusses the ordinary ethics through which pro-coal lobbyists in Australia relate to this moralized landscape and offers an analysis of the everyday and ordinary production of complicity with climate change. It argues that complicity is not just something that insufficiently ethical people engage in, but instead highlights the ways in which the coal industry derives a moral weight for its defenders. This complicity is made and reproduced precisely through the everyday practices of ethical deliberation figured in response to interpersonal moral accusations. These insights are made possible through the author's own positionality and surprising affinities with pro-coal lobbyists, and thus this paper argues for an anthropology of extractive industry which embraces the interplay of anthropological rapport and complicity. Keywords: climate change, coal mining, complicity, ethics, extractive industry, research methods. 1. Introduction. The neon signage, loud music, and smell of fried batter filled the festive atmosphere at the regular community shows, or local fairs, in the Australian coal mining region where I was doing ethnographic research in 2016. Mark and I sat under a marquee and behind a table topped with a stack of empty forms. We spent our days chatting, occasionally about coal, but mostly about travel, family, life, and love. We got to know each other well, but in doing so, performed our work poorly. We rarely stood up from behind the table and hardly ever greeted passers-by. When anyone dared approach us and interrupt our conversation, curious as to what this outlier to the festivities was, we merely attempted to coerce them into filling out a short questionnaire. This asked them questions about their perception of the mining industry, but it primarily served to get their email address for the listserv. Any interaction, even with those who refused to provide an email address, was then counted as a contact with a community member. We often joked that this language of contact was oddly tactile, but Mark dutifully tallied each brief interaction to legitimize these community outings as important work of the organization we were there representing, the Coal Community Conference. This group, as I will soon describe in more detail, was essentially a local lobbying effort of the state's Coal Lobby Organization, or CLO. Mark's and my passive involvement at these shows reflected the general ambivalence of the Australian pro-coal lobbyists that I came to know in their work as defenders of the coal industry. They often fulfilled the requirements of their formal employment, but as these moments at the community show reveal, with little zeal or effect. Often lobbyists were open to critical discussion about the coal industry with me, and were quite aware of the inconsistencies between the industry rhetoric they crafted and the reality they encountered. I was privy to these internal critiques as I blended into the everyday operations and became a member of the team. However, over 10 months observing and participating in their work, I came to recognize a pattern in the moments in which their usual ambivalence transformed into a strong and passionate defense of the industry. Their lobbying efforts were strongly motivated to counter interpersonal moral accusations that came mostly from outsiders to the lobbying group, but most strongly from family members, particularly their children. Coal mining in Australia today is enveloped in a tense and heated national debate that weighs coal's negative environmental consequences, particularly its contribution to anthropogenic climate change, against Australia's continued economic reliance on the industry, chiefly as a provider of employment to many regional communities. Environmentalist political rhetoric has embraced the phrase "coal kills," which is printed on protest signs, city graffiti, even tote bags sold by local fashion labels. Proponents of coal intentionally subvert the moral messages of coal opponents, so-called greenies in Australian slang, making their own moral case of life and death. In October 2015, the then Federal Energy Minister, Josh Frydenberg, famously argued on national television in relation to the controversial Adani Carmichael coal mine. There is a strong moral case here. Over 1 billion people don't have access to electricity. That means that more than 2 billion people today are using wood and dung for their cooking. The World Health Organization says that this leads to 4.3 million premature deaths. That's more people dying through this sort of inefficient energy than malaria, tuberculosis, and HIV/AIDS combined. So there's a strong moral case that the green activists sometimes don't comprehend. In this national political terrain, pro-coal lobbyists are contentious figures and often the subject of strong moral condemnation. I have often been asked by my anthropologist colleagues in Australia how I could tolerate spending a year with these people. How could I put up with what must surely be a frustrating climate denialism, intense ideological blinders, or outright corruption? I understand where this expectation comes from the framing of Australian leftist politics, to which the majority of my academic colleagues surely belong. These are vile informants par excellence. Other than perhaps the mine company CEOs themselves, coal lobbyists seem to be the most blameworthy for the climate crisis. Unlike actual coal miners, they do not have the working class or organized labor heritage, which complicates the moral outrage of progressives. However, after my initial transition period, I never felt particularly uncomfortable during fieldwork. Instead, I came to embrace my short membership in this community, largely because I realized that my ethical deliberations as a field worker were not so unique, but involved the same sort of everyday ethical deliberations and performances in which the lobbyists themselves participated. Thus, as I became more involved in their work and similarly complicit in the moral terrain of coal in a changing climate, I began to explore the tensions between being critical of the discourses of the coal industry while also taking seriously the everyday lives and experiences of those defending it. The debate around the ethics of research within the extractive industry is well developed, and particularly strong in debates around applied work in Australian anthropology. The contest is generally framed by, at one extreme, Kirsch's, also Benson and Kirsch, ethnographic refusal to engage with mining personnel for fear that empathy inevitably leads to co-option. And at the other extreme, social scientists at the industry-funded Centre for Social Responsibility in Mining at the University of Queensland, who are engaged in a range of applied work and industry collaborations. This paper certainly contributes to this discussion, but insists that the need to choose sides of engagement is counterproductive to our ethnographic project, as well as to the potential for anthropology to contribute to the challenges of our times. Principally here, the climate crisis. Of course, many anthropologists working on extractive issues sit within these extremes, or at least the choice to privilege one side is not always made freely. Access to one set of informants often precludes access to another. This is because, as anthropologists, we do not operate outside of the social fields we study. The choices we make both structure and are structured by the conditions in which we negotiate ethical and methodological orientations. Therefore, this paper has two interrelated goals. The first is theoretical, to examine the everyday ethical deliberations of pro-coal lobbyists and how they are fed by what I term a politics of accusation which incites moral defenses of the coal industry. The second is methodological. I argue that a similar politics of accusation within our discipline should be replaced by an embrace of the possibilities of complicity in order to make stronger contributions to understanding the crises of our times. Benson and Kirsch's influential article on harm industries argues that corporations' strategies to co-opt their critics have led to a collective sentiment they call a politics of resignation. I will show that a decade later, and with an insider ethnographic perspective of coal lobbyists, it is more accurate to describe the contemporary collective sentiment as a politics of accusation. This surrounds not only anthropological debate on the ethics of fieldwork where one must choose an allegiance, but also frames the structural and systematic crisis of anthropogenic climate change. Like the politics of resignation, this strategy similarly co-opts critique, but rather than through steps of minor reform and eventual public surrender, the politics of accusation displaces critique by encouraging divisiveness and side-taking. I will show how the politics of accusation encourages pro-coal lobbyists in their work as they turn interpersonal moral accusations into strident and effective defenses of the coal industry. Drawing from the anthropology of ordinary ethics, this paper expands on the everyday production of ethics to argue for an anthropology of extractive industry that takes seriously the need to engage in ethnographic research with vile informants, particularly in the context of ethnographies of climate change. I will first describe the context of my fieldwork and introduce some of the lobbyists with whom I worked and researched. I will describe how my role within this organization and the interpersonal relations I developed with the pro-coal lobbyists allowed me to witness the ambiguities through which they related to the industry, often through perfunctory and unproductive work alongside whispered asides of critique. I will then move on to discuss when this general ambivalence transformed into a more strident defense of the industry, including the example of the education project and the ethics of material provisioning that the lobbyists emphasized in relation to accusations of immorality that filtered into their everyday lives through their children. I will show how coal lobbyists became implicated in the moral debates that framed the context of their work. However, rather than this moralized landscape in what I term a politics of accusation leading lobbyists to question their role in propping up the coal industry, it instead caused them to rise more strongly to its defense, encouraging their lobbying efforts and increasing their efficacy. Finally, I discussed the methodological implications of these findings, principally that a similar politics of accusation hinders our discipline's ability to respond to the climate crisis. 2. The CCC as a community of complicity. The CCC is fully funded and ultimately under the direction of the state CLO, the main mining lobby group in this Australian state. The CCC was founded in 2011 at the height of the mining boom in order to address a number of local community concerns that arose as a result of the increased mining activity at the time. The CCC is presented as being neither pro nor anti-coal, but a neutral body for expressing community concerns and encouraging stakeholder dialogue. However, because the CCC is fully funded by the CLO, this is a false neutrality. The head of the CCC, Sam, expressed this to me using the CCC's logo as an example. The logo is exactly the same as the CLO's, except that it is green instead of purple. Further, all decisions ultimately rest in the executive committee, which is composed of mine representatives and the head of the CLO. And all local meetings to which community members are invited are always preceded by an industry-only meeting in which the itinerary for the joint meeting is worked out in private. Sam understood that this was a necessary condition of the funding that came from the larger lobbying organization, of which he was a direct employee, but he also recognized that it meant that the CCC could not deliver its supposed neutrality. The members of the CCC can loosely be considered those who attend its regular meetings. This includes the few employees of the CLO who serve as the secretariat, including Sam and Mark, who at the time of writing directed the general operations. There are also a number of representatives from each mining company that is a member of the CLO. These include the major players, Rio Tinto, Glencore, Anglo American, and BHP. Each mining company is represented by either a community relations manager or an environmental manager who attends meetings. Meetings are sometimes attended by a representative of the surrounding local council governments or state government department if there is a relevant point of order. During my fieldwork, there were also a number of community members who attended occasionally, including 2 local environmentalists who were the only strong critical voices in the space. They were often politely listened to, but the conversation would then move on without taking into account their views. By the time I arrived for fieldwork in late 2015, community concerns had changed significantly from those that had been voiced during the mining boom and had consequently altered the group's foundational mission. Originally set up to address concerns over the impacts of the high levels of mining activity, there was now a greater concern within the town about the future of the region once the mining industry had ceased operations. The local community members, especially those who were not or no longer directly employed in mining, considered the local economy to be less reliant on the industry than previously. Thus, they would now more readily make anti-mining arguments on the moral grounds of intergenerational and international justice linked to climate change or anxieties over the region's dependence on a threatening industry. Mark once explains, now that everyone isn't making tons of money from the mining boom, we can't get away with as much as we used to. This higher level of disagreement from the community meant that the focus of the dialogue shifted. Previously centered on immediate concerns that pragmatic interventions like weather monitoring for blast reduction could address, it now began to concern itself with broader moralized demands about the end of the coal industry and the need for diversification. As a result, the focus of the CCC shifted to communication and essentially became a local lobbying effort of its own. Mark was hired to run this new communication strategy, which included attending community events like the local show described above. It also involved Mark attempting to get favorable news stories into the local newspapers in order to highlight the CCC's positive contributions. However, the work of the CCC felt very stalled, and as I described in the opening vignette, even this communication strategy was pursued half-heartedly. In an effort to address community concerns and engage in reformist pilot projects, the CCC thus contained elements of corporate social responsibility, or CSR, in its original founding. But this merged more directly into a form of lobbying through its connections to the CLO. The anthropology of CSR is well developed. It includes research within the CSR branches of mining corporations, which has pointed out that much analysis of CSR looks at the corporation as a monolithic, rational, calculating, profit-maximizing machine. Despite the political usefulness of this view of the corporation for enabling critique, it comes at an ethnographic and epistemological cost. Severing corporations from the ordinary materials, human practices, ethics, and sentiments such as desire, fear, shame, pride, jealousy, and hope that sustain them. Thus, this paper is less concerned with the operations of the CCC as a coherent agency and more with the inconsistencies and ambiguities with which members of the CCC engage with their work, and thus the processes through which the coal industry gains a moral weight for its defenders. Throughout my time with the group, I was struck by the overarching sense amongst industry representatives, or those working in management for the mines and those employed as lobbyists, of being unfairly demonized. Having heard so much about the power of the Australian coal lobby, I was surprised to find actual fear and trepidation in the private spaces and reflections of lobbyists. They recognized that there was a need to be careful about every public record they produced because they were concerned it would be picked over by environmentalists looking for any opportunity to find even a minor inconsistency, which they feared would then be misrepresented as intentional deceit. While the goal of the CCC was meant to be transparency and genuine dialogue, this could not be achieved because of the fear of misrepresentation. The phrase, "the greenies are out to get us," was often used to justify not publicly releasing information. They would also argue that, even when they attempted to be open about information, they were not trusted. The studies we fund aren't trusted. Any information we put out isn't trusted, one person said in an industry-only meeting. In a similar meeting, a mine environmental manager said, "They're treating us like the tobacco lobby. We're being persecuted like the tobacco industry." Critical to this was the distinction between insiders and outsiders. In moments with me, lobbyists were often relatively open to critical discussion and reflection on the industry. Once I had been around for a few months and proven myself willing to work with them on projects, I was led into what Steinmuller calls a community of complicity. Communities of complicity are formed through shared knowledge of the boundaries between public discourse and lived ambiguities. My co-implication in the co-lobbyist's work allowed me to be privy to such a shared understanding. Steinmuller's choice of the term complicity points to another important element of this social dynamic. That is, belonging to this group is not just about shared understanding, it is about being co-implicated in the morality of the group and its activities. My complicity with the pro-coal lobbyists was more than Geertzian rapport, but also related to my role within a contested moral discourse. The work of the coal lobbyists takes place within a heavily moralized context, in which their work is deemed to implicate their moral character. My co-implication thus allowed me to share in the ambiguous ironies through which we commented on our work without impugning the morality of my friends, for to do so would impugn my own. For lobbyists who work in defending the industry, the particular view of the industry as immoral is often used to critique the personal morality of the lobbyists themselves. An astute mining executive in the region once explained, Our employees live in communities that we operate in, and they walk down the street in their uniforms. On one side, their name is printed. On the other is the logo of our company. Those people sometimes have to feel the backlash of our failures. This embodiment of the industry, where the work of the industry, particularly its negative impacts, became attached to the person wearing the uniform, was clearly experienced by coal mine workers, as well as pro-coal lobbyists. Lobbyists' active involvement in defending the industry through their participation in the CCC and CLO meant that much of their work involved explicit engagement in debate over its rightness or wrongness. While some mining management worked their way up from early careers in mining operations or engineering, the key lobbyists employed directly by the CLO were tertiary educated and had previously been employed in industries such as journalism and by the state government or even the State Environmental Protection Agency. Further, the lobbyists I knew mostly did not live in the mining towns themselves, but commuted from larger towns and cities nearby. Therefore, they faced regular questioning outside the workplace, as climate change and the environmental damage of the mining industry are common points of political discussion in white-collar urban Australia. All lobbyists with whom I worked also had school-aged children. Because their families lived in larger towns and cities, they attended schools in which the majority of their classmates did not have parents who worked in mining, unlike the regional mining towns. Therefore, it was not only through their employment as lobbyists defending the coal industry, but also the non-work social worlds they and their families inhabited, that they had to manage their moral and ethical position.